And thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and to reflect with you on the hopeful future of organizations. And I'm especially grateful to join this session in China, albeit virtually. Many of the challenges today are absolutely global, and I think we must find ways to build bridges between all of us across the globe to exchange and harness the best ideas and innovations about clever organizations. Because only together can we make that world of business a little brighter. Hence, big thanks again to all the organizers of the forum. And in the next 30 minutes, I would love to give you a few of our latest ideas on what it means to craft good organizations, and also on behalf of my co-author, Antoinette Weibel, from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. However, as Cherry knows, the slides you will see are an absolute draft. So I'm really looking forward to your remarks and suggestions during the Q&A. Please put any questions and observations on WeChat. And later, we can certainly also address some more practical, mundane questions about Agile or anything else you want to talk about. So let us head off into that wonderful world of business transformation. At the Teal Around the World conference at the beginning of the year, I lamented that our organizations have collectively produced numerous outcomes that nobody really wanted. There's burnout and loneliness, inequality and hunger, and ecological collapse. And since then, in spite of, I'm sure, all of us trying hard, and despite that cacophonic bubble of the new normal, it appears things have not yet become much better. Despite countless restructurings and agile transformations, government interventions, and yoga classes, our organizations are still more often suffering machines than wellsprings of well-being. And mental and physical health in the workplace have decreased almost everywhere around the world. Here in the UK, for example, 74% of the working population professes to be stressed out. Jeff Pfeffer, the American management guru, puts it very straight. Bad jobs are killing us. In the US, work-related illnesses are already the 5th leading cause of death. And when people ask me about good organizations, sadly, I often find it much easier to provide examples of bad organizations. Here are big organizations like Amazon avoiding taxes, or big organizations like Shell damaging the ecology, or other organizations who are still continuing, it seems, to exploit their employees. So maybe no surprise that 56% of global citizens believe that capitalism does more harm than good. And hence, I believe that we all, as transformation specialists and organizational architects, must take a step back. As someone suggested, we don't inherit the world from our fathers, we just borrow it from our children. It's not about the so-called future of work, but about the work of the future, how we want work to be configured. And eventually, we must ask ourselves some tough questions. Why are we really here? What legacy do we want to leave for future generations? And in all of that, what role do we want our organizations to play? Because only if we are crystal clear on our purpose, on our business ethics, can we then try to figure out how to craft such better organizations. And finally, only if we know what better organizations look like, can we, as leaders and organizational citizens, try to understand what we can help to make them become real. And of course, I'm coming from a world of Agile, but I do believe we must go beyond tribes and squads. If we don't take that step back, we could very easily fail to move forward and instead simply become better and better at making the world worse and worse. So let me dive into that big first question. Why are we really here? What is our purpose, especially in an organization? So in other words, what is it? What is good? What does it really mean to become good? And I think we have created a seductively materialistic and individualistic narrative in our Western society, where often individual freedom and money and property have become ends in themselves. In a pandemic of busyness, we have often succumbed to that hedonic treadmill of money for money's sake. People start to work ever longer hours to attain social status and wealth, just to find out that it does not really make them any happier. And in creating ever greater riches, arguably for far too few, we've often ignored ecologic externalities, just to discover that our mother planet is at the brink of bankruptcy, and the collapse of global climate will threaten the livelihoods of millions. So I think this narrative clearly can no longer be maintained. But What are the alternatives? And this is not really a question of management science, but of axiology, of ethics. So I've spent the last months diving into business ethics, and I do believe one philosopher worth looking at is Aristotle. Already 2,500 years ago, Aristotle asked what it truly means to lead a good life. And after much consideration, he concluded that our ultimate purpose as human beings is to reach our highest human potential and flourish, what he called eudaimonia, the good life. And in his philosophy, that good life is a way of life, a process, an activity, not really an outcome. And here, Aristotle's ethic, or virtue ethics, is very pragmatic and suggests that we become by doing. And someone said it nicely, said we cannot think ourselves into a new way of acting, we have to act ourselves into a new way of thinking. And the good life means continuously acting and striving for true excellence by keeping healthy, by cultivating one's intellectual and personal qualities, nurturing friendships, and seeking mutual fulfillment in society. And this, I think we all would agree, is not really easy. It requires that continuous development of moral character. We can only thrive in as much as we act with honor and integrity to fulfill our inner noble self. And here, by the way, Aristotle suggested that individual wealth for the sake of wealth is unworthy of man. And he called people extracting undue profits parasites. And I truly believe this notion of eudaimonia is very compelling for individuals, but what could it mean for organizations? And this is the very question we are asking in our new book project. And if you go to goodorganizations.com, you can see some of our draft thoughts. But Aristotle does give us some hints. He made it very clear that good work must always be good in itself, as a means to develop ourselves and contribute to that common good. Working is about flourishing, about experiencing joy, about expressing our essential humanity, about feeling connected. And it certainly is not just about individual freedom. In Aristotle's worldview, the individual is always very firmly anchored in a collaborative community and society and the ecosystem, because only in relation and friendship with others can we happily become human and realize our own calling. Hence, we thought about this, and we set out on an inquiry to find ways to craft organizations that can enable such a good life and generate what we will call aliveness, especially at three levels. Firstly, as an actor in society. Businesses become good when they act honestly and take care of their environment, beyond simply maximizing stakeholder utility or customer satisfaction or shareholder profits. And we're starting to see some examples of that. And secondly, in B, the organization is really like a mini society. It creates that container to enable mutual development of its members within a wider business and even global community. And by kind of nurturing participation and trust and virtues and those quality relationships, good organizations can, in inverted commas, create good people. And finally, the development of individuals and finally, good organizations are trustees for the development of individuals as they create opportunities to deploy individual talents and creativity with pride and dignity in organizational roles, whilst always contributing collectively to their greater purpose. And maybe you can start to feel the difference here. Rather than balancing purpose and profit or adding additional stakeholders to annual reports and balance sheet, or worse, just complying with minimum standards or ESG checklists, good organizations truly seek to contribute to that inclusive and sustainable prosperity of society as an ultimate end. Our economy must serve our humanity. And I believe that in a world where traditional communities of churches and neighborhoods have been eroded, where scientific management has often filled gaps of meanings with the gospel of growth, and where work has become very, very central in our everyday lives, we as businesses have a great opportunity to step up. Today, we can and need to create such human-centric and ecocentric organizations more than ever to provide a place of meaning and community where people can grow and flourish and attain a good life together. So on the first question, why are we really here and what's the role of organization? I will suggest the answer is Eudaimocracy. Organizations that seek a good life for everyone, including those future generations, not just bigger, but better. And actually, I do believe many people today would agree with such a premise, but struggle to understand how to evolve from where they are. And as a result, as we've seen, change is very slow. And whatever consultants might sometimes tell us, I think we here all know that there are no simple answers. Like people, every organization is different. However, I believe it's very clear that we cannot simply continue as before. On the one hand, we live in an ever more complex world, facing ever faster changes, advances in technology and data, shortening half-life of knowledge, and ever greater global interdependency. So in these new 20s, we must let go of the illusion that work can be predicted or planned in detail. As BCG suggested, the companies that will win in the 2020s are those who can compete on learning. The simple truth is that our world has become too complex to be controlled through bureaucracy. But on the other hand, as I just said, I believe we must create organizations that do not unwittingly perpetuate that neoliberal myth of unbounded individualism and social Darwinism and create suffering. It's not just about becoming more agile or more customer-centric or more entrepreneurial. The good organizations of the futures must both effectively embrace change and create an environment to maximize human flourishing at and through work, rather than just driving efficiency and productivity. Hence, we must carefully understand how our purpose and organizational practices correlate. So what does that really mean? In order to enable both goodness and efficiency, I believe we must have the courage to take a step back and redesign work to adapt the context for all our teams at several different levels in terms of governance, structure, and management practices, but also in terms of corporate culture and leadership. And here, in terms of structure, as I'm sure all of you probably would agree with, organizations fundamentally navigate between two polarities: differentiation to achieve adaptiveness, autonomy, and subsidiarity, and integration to attain stability, learning, solidarity, and scale, unbundling and rebundling. And there are many ways to do it. But in my experience, central authority simply does not lend itself to decentralized experimentation and learning when facing complexity. In ING, we were one of the first banks to roll out Agile at scale globally. And as I think we demonstrated, Agile can provide more flexibility within the pyramid, enabling self-organization and cross-functional flows of information and decision-making. And following on from Agile, we are seeing more and more ambidextrous organizations that seek to exploit the existing whilst also exploring the new, but it's not going to stop there. We are already seeing other examples of adaptive organizations with very strong community cultures and participative networks of team, like in Bullsorg or Mondragon. We're seeing highly market and customer-centric ecosystems and platforms with micro-enterprises in Rendon, High and higher. And we're seeing experiments with interconnected circles based on holacracy or sociocracy, for example, at Zappos or Medium. However, our question was how to ensure that our organizations are not only adaptive, but truly support our purpose. And we must realize, I think, that all organizational practices, especially those that carry strategic or organizational or motivational content, also carry moral significance. Our mental paradigms and beliefs of how our world works shape our institutions and vice versa. So here you can see a very simplistic example of kind of different worldviews, very loosely aligned with the colors in Spiral Dynamics of Frederic Laloux's book on reinventing organizations. And borrowing also from Carol Sanford's book, No More Feedback. So the extract value paradigm at the bottom is about maximizing profits and utilitarianism. And in that typical orange market organization, all eyes are on clients and competition. The customer is allegedly king. What's in reality, it's mostly about profit. The culture is meritocratic, based on growth and market success, and it's predominantly individualistic, powered by behaviorist incentives. The principle really is the winner takes it all. In an impulse order paradigm, which is more conservative and about deontology, we have these amber bureaucratic machine organizations where the CEO is boss and order and rules are clear. The budgetary planning is highly ritualized with lots and lots of sessions and targets cascaded from top to bottom. And as we all know, politics very often abounds, conformity is highly praised, and the head office sets the tone. And as a result, the elite few command and control the many others. Instead, the do-good paradigm, as Carol calls it, and I'm using Paul Polman's new book title of Net Positive a bit cheekily here, is about dignity and human rights. And the typical green family organization values harmony and cares for its constituents and seeks to do both good and well. However, what good looks like is defined categorically by the head office for everybody. And then people are empowered to align themselves with the company purpose and values and norms and collaborate with each other. But the idea is a little bit of saving the world in my way. So it's very clear that there's one person who has an ideal of what it should look like. And finally, we got these, as an example, these evolutionary or teal paradigms where it's all about integrative consciousness. And I know you spoke to Fred Laloux already, so I won't repeat it here, but you will recall the key principles were wholeness, self-management, and evolutionary purpose. And the mantra is that we reinvent organizations through a next stage in human development. And as I've argued elsewhere, I agree with many of Fred's suggestions and find kind of many of the ideas beautiful, but the philosophy behind it for me is somewhat mystic. It relies mainly on ever greater consciousness, assuming that good action will just naturally ensue. But by all means, anyway, my key point here is that it's very important to investigate how our own worldviews, beliefs, and convictions shape our organizations. As my late friend Brian Ungert was always saying, the dominant paradigm has that nasty capacity to suck in all other worldviews. And especially in our Western cultures, we often reify differentiation and freedom and autonomy. And in my experience, that is a problem because the truth is that flourishing always requires both order and freedom, or as we say in psychology, both paternal and maternal containing. Bill Torbett speaks about liberating structures like principles and roles and routines, rituals and methodologies to enable and host generative dialogue and development involving as many people as possible. And that is also why we believe that Eudaimocratic organizations must go beyond structures and first and foremost pledge to create what Henry Mintzberg calls in his book on rebalancing society, true communityship. They must consciously develop and adapt the institutions of the firm to support an ethos of participation and interdependence, to enable individuals to form their character and attain agency and identity and relationships and meaning within the community. And you remember Aristotle's notion that we flourish only in and with the community. And this really requires the development of some organizational virtues. On the one hand, I think we need solidarity and integrity and fairness as the very basis for collaborative work. And here solidarity implies reciprocity and mutual support, as well as shared responsibility in the service of a common cause. Integrity is about moral courage to stand up for what we know is right for the good of all. And that goes hand in hand with fairness, which is really that everybody has a right to participate in important decisions. And on the other hand, there's also an emotional aspect, which is to grow together and learn from one another requires empathy and compassion and trust, especially trust we know is the fertilizer for both quality relationships as well as autonomy and subsidiarity. If I trust you, I'm willing to give you more freedom and let go. And whilst trust cannot be demanded, it can be nurtured within an organization. Compassion, on the other hand, ensures that there's space for trial and error, and it's a critical catalyst for growth, therefore. And finally, kindness is really about respect and promoting diversity and supporting listening to and learning from one another. And in a nutshell, I believe that if we want to develop truly excellent, in the Aristotelian sense, organizations that are human-centric and sustainable and highly performant and innovative and contribute to that aliveness, we need to actively foster organizational virtues through our structures and processes or practices so that people both co-elevate together and also take individual risk to be entrepreneurial. Hence, my second key point will be that it's not primarily about changing structure or culture, as lots of expensive consultants will suggest, but it's about deliberately developing and forming and shaping organizational character with the help of structure. And I will boldly state that character eats culture for breakfast. So the question then becomes, how can we enable organizational character and virtues. And I believe that requires at least three connected things. The first is removing toxic practices. The second is about developing individual agency. And finally, it's about promoting practical wisdom at individual and collective level. So firstly, let me go back to the point that I made, that both structures and practices carry moral significance. And one more point on structure. I think here we must all beware of the proverbial moving deck chairs on the Titanic. When companies are stuck, they love to redraw org charts and job titles. As Henry Mintzberg writes, kind of, if in doubt, reorganize. But very often they do not truly revise the distribution of information, knowledge, and power. And very often knowledge is power. And I've seen many agile implementations really struggle because they never dealt with the existing power or ownership structures. And in good organizations, therefore, I think we must decentralize power and move information not just upwards, but everywhere, so that strategy truly becomes a firm-wide conversation. But in terms of practices, I think we especially must watch out for toxic practices that could jeopardize our idea of eudaimonia, and especially in HR and finance. And frankly, I really do not understand why some organizations still insist on many of these practices. There's endless research to really prove that they never worked. So here's our personal current top 10 of toxic practices to just give you some food for thought. CEO pay and performance management are my all-time negative favorites, but I also have lots of thoughts on this notion of compliance, where people start to tick the boxes. And there's a lot of thinking around compliance or rules starting to erode the very propensity of people, and especially managers, to act with kind of ethical and moral responsibility. However, on the other side, I think we must be equally aware that we cannot just copy and paste good practices. As I said earlier, every organization is unique. And in fact, in a Eudaimocracy, more than providing any simple answers or recipes, we must enable an environment where people are engaged to ask the right questions and collectively experiment and evolve, not only in terms of how they deliver, but also in regards to how they organize, so that over time, organizations become true laboratories of ideas, integrating action and inquiry into everything we do, always sensing and exploring and experimenting whilst we're moving in teams or that peer community of learning. And this brings me to my second enabler, which is about personal agency. And in our businesses, we've very often treated people like easily replaceable human capital, or as exchangeable resources to be controlled. And as a result, we all know more than 75% of employees are somewhat disengaged. And hence, in order to build good and flourishing organizations, I think we must relearn to cherish the very uniqueness of our people and fulfill their basic human needs, their sense of orientation and belonging and autonomy and self-esteem. It's not about human resources, but about resourceful humans. And whilst I do believe that people naturally engage and develop if the conditions are right, in a world where we are all required to wear many different masks, where our kind of internal and external lives have become separated, it has become very challenging just to be with ourselves and with each other. Hence, I believe we must deliberately invest in practices that help people to go below that proverbial iceberg and recognize their own biases and needs and anxieties, attachment styles, and defense and coping mechanisms to grow their ability to work with and care for others and co-generate meaning and value in service of the community. As Frederic Laloux once said, we can only go far into the we if we fully inhabit the I. However, it is not only about social skills or knowledge, but also to promote that personal excellence and virtues through self-reflection and consciousness and critical thinking, and through that almost spiritual experience of being part of something greater. And here again, I think the key message is we cannot do this in an ivory tower. In good organizations, the focus always remains on that mutual embeddedness within the community, the possibility to discuss important life topics with others, to co-elevate and co-validate in the movement of learners, and to foster the blossoming of human virtues like honor and friendliness and courage, modesty and self-knowledge. So if we build virtuous practices, a strong community can become a true breeding ground for the development of the individual in terms of agency and relationships, competence and character. And I think at the end, true success is only when every human being at work gains the ability to develop and flourish using their creativity and having impact together, when agency becomes activism. And this brings me to my third enabler, what Aristotle called phronesis, or practical wisdom, the ability to reflect with and in action and make sound judgments that enable flourishing. And if we're honest, business life today is very complex and there simply are no shortcuts. Balancing these polarities such as stability and change, differentiation and integration, profit, aliveness, in the midst of the daily demands in a fast-moving market is very difficult. Hence, we, I think, must get away from a simplistic efficiency imperative or these superficial fail fast mantras, and instead systematically promote collective learning and development towards a truly moral corporate governance that embraces and fosters a practical ethics of life. And here again, Eudaimocracy means that leadership and management tasks are, on the one hand, radically decentralized so that employees can act contextually with self-determination and mutual trust, whilst on the other hand, decisions also remain always subsidiary to that common good of all, to that good life, for example, by using sociocratic decision-making methods. Good action always remains an end in itself. The aim is to increase the vitality of the interconnected ecosystem through positive and regenerative relationships. And to be very concrete, what in my experience matters most and is most lacking is really the creation of an ethical zone where we create regular and systematic breathing spaces to reflect on what is the best way to act and organize. I think we need to relearn to go on the balcony with ourselves and stay with the trouble, fostering dialogical and deliberate organizational development, as well as a very conscious inquiry into what is our own role within that organizational system. Rather than just rushing faster and faster, we must regain our cardinal capacity to deeply reflect and develop collective consciousness. So in conclusion, I believe that if we establish virtuous practices through community and enable collaborative development, promote that individual agency, and also develop practical wisdom, we can nurture what I will call virtuous or Eudaimocratic organizations. And my key point is that structures and processes continuously grow organically and dynamically with the capacity of the people and the collective, and also continuously adapt to both internal and external needs in order to support and strengthen the community's creative drive and to foster that pulsing energy of organizational life. In fact, in a Eudaimocracy, deep emotional bonds of community and trust matter as much as outcomes, and individuals and teams experience and learn and develop together in service of that meaningful purpose. And ideally, the community promotes the individual and sparks in the individual an earnest desire to grow with and contribute to the community. Sounds good? Well, unfortunately, in my experience, many organizations get stuck. Why? I regret to say so, dear colleagues and friends, but I believe it's often because of us. In fact, my number one lesson in Agile was that leadership has become a lot more difficult. And not only in terms of leaders' moral accountabilities, but also in regards to their roles within the organizational system. And notably, the maturity of an organization can never transcend the maturity and consciousness of its leadership. If greater consciousness doesn't operate, a system simply does not possess the stability to let go of the past and transition to a new model. And in a nutshell, if our definition of success remains that going up the ladder from VP to SVP to EVP, well, hierarchy prevails. If we dominate others just to uphold our own ego, people around us won't flourish. If we seek to kind of control the uncertainty in our environment with ever more rigidity and then budgets, self-organization will perish. And finally, if we try to shrink the complexity of the world to our own cognitive limits, we must fail. And the truth is, in a world of self-organization and adaptiveness, there simply is no place anymore for patriarchal commanders-in-chief who rule by positional power and dominance. Good leaders focus on the why, not the how. Decisions are always made at the lowest possible level, close to the customer. And rather than telling people what to do, leaders today need to become guarantors and caretakers of the institution, of that community, building, sensing, caring for, and influencing the organizational system, and enabling that co-creation and emergence of aliveness. In such a new world, we need chief communicators who earn the respect of their people by making personal sacrifices to serve the collective good, and chief connectors who can create a force field of energy, placing their needles a bit like acupuncturists to facilitate those life and energy flows in an organizational body, fostering psychological safety and trust, reinforcing transparency and embracing failure, and role modeling gratitude and compassion and kindness. And such a new transpersonal leadership paradigm, as John Knight calls it, is more than just EQ. It integrates intellectual, emotional, and spiritual intelligence. Servant leaders lead beyond the ego, allowing time for awareness and reflection rather than jumping into action, letting go to become vulnerable imperfectionists, and holding the space for others to attain self-mastery, agency, and meaning. And I quite like this quote, as John Quincy Adams once said, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you're a leader." And I think for traditional leaders, honestly, who have risen the corporate chain by being in control, this is a very difficult challenge. What brought us here won't bring us there. And hence the key question is, how can we transcend? What's that breakthrough? I always say when I was young, I had all the answers. Now I'm old, I got all the questions. But in my personal experience, progression here requires a conscious choice and cultivation of vertical development, facing our own shadows and emotion, understanding our attachments and relationships, and letting go of restrictive mental models, hearing our soul knocking at the ego's door. And responsible leaders, Manfred Keats de Vries said, are not only born, but twice born through a process of painful individuation, where every victory of the self feels like a defeat for the ego, until we can compassionately see all these different facets and that tension field between us, our roles, and the worldviews that sit behind that, and the relationships that we have. And only through that deep development can we master the capability to act and inquire in a moment, what Bill Torbett calls action inquiry, so that we can, in the heat of the action, make sure that we turn virtuous intentions into virtuous acting. But above all, I think we need to take the time to reflect in order to tap into what really matters to us, feeling how everything is profoundly connected, loving ourselves and others for mutual growth, and letting go of fears and the desire to control, so that we can truly serve life beyond the confines of our ego. As Mark Twain once quipped, the two most important days in our lives are when we were born and when we find out why. And I can assure you, once you fully commit yourself to serve that good life synchronously, the world around you changes too. And suddenly, leadership is not a tribe of special individuals with special traits and not even a role, but about letting go of authority and unleashing that unique potential and aliveness in everyone, about people no longer being victims of circumstances, but thriving in the creation of new possibilities and new ways to be, about learning together how to shape a more responsible future. And here, coming to an end of my presentation, let me offer you a final insight. I'm almost 50 and I started working with kind of agile and business transformation 20 years ago. And I don't know how many leadership seminars I attended or how many projects I was involved in. Fact is that it took myself almost 15 years to acknowledge that sustainable organizational transformation is only possible through concurrent individual transformation. We are that system. Yet that also means that we all, I believe, have the power and the responsibility to transform our organizations and our relationships from who we are and how we show up. And we can all spark that transformation of our organizations by gradually crafting the structures and processes and the character required to attain an environment for individual and collective flourishing and the evolution of that good society. And beyond our own businesses, I think we can and must stand up as leaders for a new collective narrative to overcome some of the limitations of the social materialism that we have today, where work has dignity and success is not only about money, but aliveness and virtues and character. And hence closing, I believe today is an important time for all of us to occupy those front rows in our lives and make conscious choices, not only driving agility and adaptiveness, but growing to serve a better life, not with a perfect plan, but starting somewhere and inquiring and adapting whilst we go. And I really want to thank all of you who have contributed and all of you who are joining us on that journey. So finally, let us together roll up our sleeves and evolve our organizations with wisdom and virtues and courage and compassion and the best of our collective knowledge and practices and insights. We are not leaders because we rule. We are leaders because we truly care. And with that, I have a few slides here in the pack for people who want to have some ideas on how to start the journey. And as always, requested some books that you might want to have a look at. You can just get them by contacting to me on LinkedIn or having a look at our goodorganizations.com website. And with that, I would say thank you all very much. And Cherry, back to you.